Psychology. Some definitions. What is it to be a psychologist? According to the American Psychological Association, in order to call yourself a psychologist, you must have a doctorate in psychology. Could be a doctor of philosophy in psychology, a PhD, or a PsyD, a doctorate in psychology. Then you can call yourself a doctor of psychology, an academic doctor, and you are a psychologist. If you get another qualification lower than that, typically a master's, you can be a therapist. But a therapist can work in different disciplines. It could be a therapist that's a clinical therapist, clinical psychology. That would be a master's in clinical psychology. They could be a social work therapist, what they call a licensed clinical social worker. Also a master's, a different license, still can do therapy. And finally, MFT, or counseling degrees, which are similar. MFT is marriage and family therapy. Counseling is your typical counseling degree, which could have a subspecialization in either family and marriage, mental health, or school. You might see in other disciplines on occasion, but those are probably the most common. So you could be a therapist with a master's in psychology and be licensed to do so. You could also have a PhD in psychology, either a PsyD or a clinical PhD, and then you could also get a license to do therapy. If you did a PhD, it takes longer and it's harder for you to get into those programs, but you'll be more accomplished and more prestigious a degree. Sometimes that kind of degree at the PhD level will be required to run a mental health clinic or a big program or the head of some nonprofit organization. A lot of big jobs, so to speak, require that you have a graduate PhD or PsyD. If you're just content to be a therapist and that title is okay with you, you could be a clinical psychology therapist, a counseling therapist, or a family therapist, or a social work therapist. As a psychology undergraduate graduate, you will be qualified for any of those things, and part of your journey is figuring out which of those disciplines work the way you want them to. They all help to serve the public with mental health conditions, but they do it in slightly different philosophical and methodological ways. As you go through psychology and learn about these different things, and your advisor, me in this case, will help teach students to understand the differences, you can figure out the various options in psychology as a discipline. Many students ask, do I need a master's to go on to a job in psychology? Quite often, to get a well-paid job with high responsibility, then you might probably need a minimum of a master's. PhD gives you more prestige and more responsibility potentially, and more earning power. But you might be content with a master's. It's up to you what suits your needs. Most professional jobs in psychology don't actually start at the undergraduate level. You probably have to get at least a master's or a PhD or PsyD in order to get the better jobs. The exception I might see in Illinois is jobs involving corrections, aka prisons, tend to pay better, and sometimes better even than master's level jobs in other fields. But not every student wants to work in that environment. It's really up to your individual desires. But probably to get the best jobs and the most competition out of yourself, you should have a graduate degree, which you apply to separately after you graduate your undergraduate. Typically, the application process starts the year before you actually would start the graduate program, which is usually the fall of the final year of the student. And that's when you would work with the advisor to apply to your program, your graduate program. Now, you may want to take a break. I took actually a break of 5 years. You can take a break as many years in between as you want. Many students do, and sometimes it's a good idea to take a break to get yourself sorted out and kind of reflect on what you want to do. You may not be able to decide the semester before you graduate what graduate degree you want to apply to. You would work with your advisor to work through these things. And you also have to ask yourself, do I want to spend a certain amount of money and time in this? A master's degree is typically 2.5 to 3 years. A PsyD or a regular PhD in psychology is probably going to be 5 years. Clinical PhD is often 7 years because of all the supervised training you have to undergo as part of these clinical realms. So that's a lot of time and money to spend, and each student is different in whether or not they think that's going to be what suits them. So you have to think about it carefully. One distinction that's not always clear is that a PsyD is typically 5 years. It's a doctorate of psychology, less emphasis on research, a bit more on hands-on therapeutic methodology. Whereas a PhD is focused on both research and therapy when it comes to clinical psychology, and it's often longer in terms of the supervised training, thus it's often 7 years, not just the typical 5 for a PhD. So choosing clinical psychology as your graduate studies could be a long road at most schools, typically 7 years. I have heard some schools will do it in 5. UIC in Chicago is one of them from what I understand. But each student has to come to the conclusion of whether they want to spend the time, the money involved. Sometimes you can get a pretty close to free ride at graduate level, particularly in PhD programs. There's more money available as scholarships when you're accepted as a student. So look into that and decide if that cost is more. For that reason, sometimes it can be cheaper to do a 5-year PhD than it takes to do a 3-year master's. So when it comes to costs, you might actually find the PhD, if you can get into the programs, which are more competitive than masters, but the payoffs in terms of rewards, in terms of scholarships, can be higher. Good luck.